We're so happy to have this distinguished gathering of exceptional scholars and activists on this extraordinarily important topic. The roundtable this afternoon is Civil Rights Movement, the Past and Contemporary Legacies. And I'm going to introduce our three panelists, members of the roundtable, and then in the order in which I introduce them, I'm going to ask them to speak for a while, and then we'll have a discussion here, and we'll open it up to the floor. So I'll begin with Jean Theoharis. Jean Theoharis is Distinguished Professor of Political Science at Brooklyn College of the City University of New York, and is the author or co-author of 7 books and numerous articles on the civil rights and Black Power movements, the politics of race and education, social welfare, and civil rights in post-9/11 America. Her widely acclaimed biography, The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks, won a 2014 NAACP Image Award and the Letitia Woods Brown Award from the Association of Black Women Historians. It appeared on the New York Times bestseller list and was named one of the 25 best academic titles of 2013 by Choice. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, MSNBC, The Nation, Slate, The Atlantic, Boston Review, Salon, The Intercept, and the Chronicle of Higher Education. Her new book, A More Beautiful and Terrible History, The Uses and Misuses of Civil Rights History, came out in January from Beacon Press. Jean, welcome. The next person is somebody who is very well known to us here at Brown, at any rate, and perhaps to all of you who have been here this morning now. And she's Maya Gamble Rivers, and is a recent Brown University graduate, receiving her master's in public humanities and completing her fellowship at the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice, CSSJ. She now serves as the manager of programs and outreach for the CSSJ, and I can say a very competent and effective manager, developing programs and curriculum for high school students in the city of Providence, and serves on the center's curatorial team. In 2015, she developed a curriculum, led workshops, and accompanied students on a civil rights trip throughout the South with 30 Baltimore high school students, which has now completed its 3rd year of programming. The third panelist, member of the roundtable, is also well known to us, and she is Francoise Hamlin, an associate professor in history and Africana Studies here at Brown, in this department, of course, and teaches undergraduate and graduate courses primarily in 20th century U.S. history, African American history, Southern history, cultural studies, and Africana studies. Prior to joining the faculty at Brown, Professor Hamlin was a Du Bois Mandela Rodney Fellow at the University of Michigan and an assistant professor of history at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. Since then, she has been a Charles Warren Center Fellow at Harvard University and a Woodrow Wilson Mellon Fellow. Most recently, she is the American Council of Learned Societies Frederick Burkhardt Fellow at the Radcliffe Institute. Welcome home, Francois. Okay, so we'll begin with Jean, who will have her say, and then we follow with Maya, and then Francois, in that order.
Are we going to speak from here or up there?
You can choose whichever you wish. If you're more comfortable up there, then that's fine.
Good afternoon. It's great to be here. 2 summers ago, as protests mounted across the country following the police killings of Alton Sterling and Philando Castile, then Atlanta Mayor Kasim Reeves celebrated Atlanta as the home of Dr. King. But in explaining the large police presence at downtown protests to reporters, he remarked, "Dr. King would never take a freeway." 3 years ago, former presidential candidate Mike Huckabee instructed Ferguson protesters to be more like Martin Luther King. CNN's Wolf Blitzer wished for King in Baltimore. And the Reverend Barbara Reynolds took to the pages of the Washington Post to tell Black Lives Matter activists they should learn from the civil rights movement. We were not, and I quote her, "We were nonviolent activists who won hearts by conveying respectability and changed laws by delivering a message of love and unity." Across the political spectrum over the past 4 years, commentators have invoked the history, or what I would call the mishistory of the civil rights movement, to chastise and correct Black Lives Matter, casting today's protesters as too angry and reckless and leaderless and not living up to the peaceful, respectable, unified legacy of the civil rights movement. Now, these framings represent the movements Black Lives Matter activists are building across the country, and they greatly distort the history of the civil rights movement, trafficking in what I call a national fable of the civil rights movement that distorts and obscures many aspects of the history of that struggle. This fable, this national fable, tells a story of a Southern movement galvanized by Rosa Parks and the leadership of Martin Luther King, peopled by the courageous sort of Southern Black people and supported by good white Northern liberals, journalists, and the federal government, who struggled and succeeded in passing the two landmark pieces of legislation, the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Julian Bond will call this the master narrative, right? It is a tale filled with good guys and bad guys and a happy ending. A powerful story of individual grit and the power and strength of American exceptionalism. The importance of this story crosses partisan lines, and I would argue gathers steam when President Ronald Reagan changes his position and his longtime opposition to a federal holiday for Martin Luther King and signs the legislation marking the third Monday of January as a federal holiday for Dr. King on November 2nd, 1983. And I quote from his remarks. "Now, our nation has decided to honor Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. by setting aside a day each year to remember him and the just cause he stood for. We've made historic strides since Rosa Parks refused to go to the back of the bus. As a democratic people, we can take pride in the knowledge that we Americans recognized a grave injustice and took action to correct it. And we should remember that in far too many countries, people like Dr. King never would have the opportunity to speak out at all." Now, Reagan's remarks zeroed in on what would soon become the key elements of a national fable of the civil rights movement and the ways increasingly that the civil rights movement is publicly honored, memorialized, held up, and simultaneously stripped of its power. The fable was that there had been an injustice, but once these courageous individuals freely pointed it out, it was corrected, and so proved the greatness of American democracy. Now, Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks are key linchpins of this fable, honored and trotted out over and over as proof of our national progress and as a way to paper over current injustice. They have been turned into, I think, Thanksgiving parade balloons. Jolly, larger than life, unthreatening, bobbing along, proud of our progress, and basically unrecognizable to kind of the substance and scope of their sort of political vision and the work that they spent their lives doing. Now, why the fable? I think the fable exists for a number of reasons. It has increasingly become central to how the United States talks about itself, talks about its history, and partly I think this fable justifies both action and inaction. Racism and struggle are put decidedly in the past. It's kind of a cleansing, it's a cathartic, moving, inspiring narrative, but it also allows for a kind of distance and cleansing that in some sense we would have been part of that great movement that King led, but today's movements are too radical, reckless, fly-by-night, leaderless. Second, I think the fable gives us a national identity, and it's become increasingly used to prove how great American democracy is and to kind of showcase our democracy. In many ways, I think it portrays the United States like a self-cleaning oven, right? That we're just constantly making better. Third, I think it puts the civil rights movement on a pedestal, quite literally, right? If we think about sort of many of the key kind of honorings recently, right? If we think about the opening of the King Memorial in DC, the Rosa Parks statue in the Statuary Hall, right? It's about pedestalizing them, trapping them, making them also unreachable, right? Or as Vincent Harding would say, unavailable for where we need them today. It also, I think, makes it impossible to see how we do it again. Again, by putting it on the pedestal, by making it seem like it just happens, it makes it difficult to sort of see the lessons that we could take from it today. So I wanted to talk about a couple of the myths, and I wanted to do so through the lens of Rosa Parks. There is no way to be here today and not to be deeply sad by the decision of Brown University to forego what could have been an incredible revisioning, re-seeing of Rosa Parks and the civil rights movement by the cancellation of the exhibit that was going to surround what is referred to as the Rosa Parks house. That house was her brother Sylvester Macaulay's house, and Sylvester is key to why the Parks, when they have to leave Montgomery in 1957, come to Detroit. That's where he and his wife and kids are living, and so that family will anchor the Parks here, but it also is a window into the deep segregation and inequality that the Parks encounter in Detroit, what she will describe as the northern promised land that wasn't. And she will spend the next half of her life, Rosa Parks spends more of her life in the North than in the South, fighting the racism of the Jim Crow North. In part because while some of the public signs of segregation are gone, what she finds in terms of housing segregation, school segregation, job discrimination, police brutality, right, that they left behind, they find again in Detroit. And so I think many times when we honor, and Rosa Parks is honored regularly, and we spent the morning thinking about different kinds of memorials, right? I think we're turning our attention to the civil rights movement, and the memorials of the civil rights movement are positive, they're inspiring, and their danger is somewhat different than what we were talking about this morning. And the danger is, right, we trap Rosa Parks in the South, we trap Rosa Parks on the bus, we trap her, in the words of the New York Times, in their obituary of her, as the accidental matriarch of the civil rights movement. When Rosa Parks basically had a lifetime of struggle, beginning with Scottsboro, beginning with voter registration, beginning with legal lynching cases like Jeremiah Reeves, beginning with Recy Taylor, right, to the bus, and an action that she'd actually resisted on the bus before, which galvanizes the Montgomery bus boycott, to a second half of her life where she stands with kind of a militant labor movement in Detroit, where she stands with a militant anti-war movement in Detroit, where she sits on the People's Tribunal in 1967 trying to hold police accountable for the kind of violence and brutality that they initiated during the uprising, to the Gary Convention, to the movement against apartheid in South Africa, to opposing the nomination of Clarence Thomas, to 8 days after 9/11, she joins with Harry Belafonte and Danny Glover and a number of civil rights activists to call on the United States no war, to work with the international community, an incredibly prescient statement given now 15 years of war. And so I think what I would want us to talk about in this session is the ways that we memorialize her, right? If we think about her funeral, right? Rosa Parks becomes the first civilian, the first woman, the second African-American to lie in honor in the Capitol. And yet I don't think we can understand why that happens without the kind of context of Hurricane Katrina less than 2 months earlier, right? And a growing national conversation about persistent racial inequality, and that Rosa Parks' coffin in the Capitol helped to sort of put a different conversation, right? Because in many ways, the way that Rosa Parks was honored was about, look how far we've come. And then if we fast forward to 2013, when Rosa Parks' statue is being installed in Statuary Hall, in an sort of an interesting moment of bipartisanship, right? Republican leaders, John Boehner, Mitch McConnell, Nancy Pelosi joined President Obama to dedicate the statue. Becomes a celebration of America. On the very same day that the Supreme Court is hearing arguments in Shelby County v. Holder, a case, as we know, that the court will come back a few months later and say, and strip one of the key provisions of the Voting Rights Act on the idea that it's no longer relevant to present day, right? So a statue of Rosa Parks, figuratively, right, is about putting the movement in the past, putting racial injustice in the past, on this very same day that something that she and many of her comrades had spent decades fighting for was being kind of stripped down. And so I guess where I would end is kind of asking us to think about the ways we honor even the people that we are most familiar with, right? I mean, certainly there's a need to expand how we think about the civil rights movement. Certainly it happens in many places, right? From here in Providence to Boston to Detroit to LA. But also the stories that we tell through the people that we memorialize, and the need to change those stories. The need to kind of see bigger, to tell a story of Rosa Parks that's not just about the South, but it's about the North. It's not just about the bus, but it's about a kind of lifelong passion and commitment to changing the criminal justice system. Thank you.
So my name is Maya Gamble-Rivers, and I am the Manager of Programs and Outreach at the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice here at Brown. I started at the center in 2014. I was a graduate fellow, and while I was there, I was tasked with creating youth programming for the center, and part of that involved organizing large school groups, but then also creating after-school programming. My sister at the time was an educator at a charter school. She helped to start a charter school in Baltimore City called City Neighbors High School, and they were a part of this larger collective of 3 Baltimore high schools who every year went on a civil rights trip throughout the South. She'd come back every year telling me how emotional the trip was and how much she cried and that I needed to go. But I had a lot of reservation because my grandparents are from South Carolina, and they left Jim Crow, South Carolina at the age of 18 and 19. And so I've heard stories of what the Jim Crow South was like, and I didn't want to be anywhere near it. And so I also realized that there was a certain level of vulnerability that was needed to go and have an experience that she was describing. And I didn't think I was ready. And it wasn't until I talked with her a bit more and understood that an experience like that would allow me to share something with students that I wish I had when I was in high school. Growing up in Rhode Island, didn't really understand or know that there was slavery in the state of Rhode Island until I was 15. I didn't, again, study slavery in the state until I was a senior in high school, and I graduated 11 years ago. Just give you a sense of how old I am. But there was also a lot of fear because I worried, how could I teach something that I was never taught? But what I learned was that I had to learn with them, and I actually learned a lot from my students. And so the Civil Rights Movement Initiative was something that I envisioned my second year as a graduate fellow, and I remember approaching Tony with my budget and my ideas for workshops, and I really didn't think he was gonna let me do it, but to my surprise, he did. And we just completed our 3rd year of the Civil Rights Movement Initiative. what is very near and dear to me is that I get to work with the high school that I graduated from, Hope High, and a lot of the students will be here tomorrow to present on their experience. So a mix of students from the first 3 years. And so just to give you a sense of what the program is we invite students to the CSSJ for 6 weeks of workshops. Some of the topics include protest and racial tension, there's music in the civil rights movement, there's Jim Crow in education. We also visit 6 states, 11 cities in 1 week. And by Brown joining this initiative with the high schools in Baltimore, we've been able to add trips like Tougaloo College, or the Medgar Evers Historic House Museum that is in Jackson, Mississippi. We get to meet activists along the way, such as Andrew Young, John Lewis, Roscoe Jones, Hollis Watkins. And so I'm just gonna play a clip from this year's lunch talk. So once the students return from the week long, they actually give a presentation in this very room about their experience. And so every year I compile a video from the beginning event to the end of what that student experience looked like. So I will play that now if Alonzo can turn the lights down.
Lord God, I ask that you bless each and every one that is on this bus and guide them, Lord God. Bless them to learn something. Bless them to all get along and come back as a changed person. Father God, and we thank you. And it's in Jesus' name we pray and ask you these things. Amen.
All right, so this is the first museum, and I learned a lot here because we touched upon a lot of things from the workshop, like A&T, like there was like a whole list of people that were kind of like full shoulders, like I said. We never really learned about them. There's a lot of people that were important in the movement that were providing a lot.
He was talking about the war in Vietnam, and he could have said the same thing about the war with Korea.
Before I went on the trip, I had no idea who he was. But then when we went to the final stop at the motel where Martin Luther King was shot, I saw the picture of Andrea right there.
I got chills.
So my favorite part was like I got wasted. It was cool.
I think my anger was really because when I came on the trip, I was kind of angry. Like, you know, during our workshops and stuff, you just hear stuff and you're like, oh, that just makes me so mad. But like slowly my anger started turning into like bewilderment. Like, how can someone even do this? Like, it stopped being anger and it turned into just pure confusion. Like I just didn't know what to do with my feelings. They're so jumbled up that it was like, I don't even know like how to describe them. It was like confusion, like astonishment at something, and it turned into sadness too. Like, it was just like, I just can't even deal with this. Like me as a teenager, we sit here and complain about the littlest things that happen to us. And then looking at those images during the trip, it made me realize that we lived a far better life than they ever would.
I want to thank all the sponsors of this trip because it provided a really nice experience where I got to meet new people and got closer to the people I already know. I learned a lot of history in a week, more than I learned through my whole entire schooling. So it was a really rewarding experience. Thank you.
Unfortunately, I don't have a video, I just have lots of pictures, so bear with me. Good afternoon. So apart from teaching US history in the classroom in traditional ways that classrooms really restrict us to, just like Maya, I've developed a spring break trip to Mississippi through a competitive application making use of the 23-year partnership between Brown and Tougaloo College. And I was asked to speak about that trip here today. So before coming to Brown, I had a deep relationship with Mississippi due to my own research across the state, but particularly in the Delta. I lived in Clarksdale for a whole year as an exchange student from London, and that experience had really set my life's journey. I know Tougaloo College well, and many of the faculty well, having done research there for my dissertation many years ago, in the early 2000s. And through the partnership, I know Mississippi better than I even know Rhode Island and how many, Dunkin' Donuts there are and stuff like that. But these trips are also really personal to me. One of my motivations is to draw out empathy in students. Not just because it's not your experience doesn't mean that you can't try to understand what it's like to walk in the shoes of someone else. I went to Mississippi when I was 18. I was surprised, culturally unprepared as a high school exchange student. And my own reactions then match those of my students now, and I do feel like this is one way in which I can give back, but also to better educate. And on the surface level, I wanted students to see and feel the place that had moved me to a life pursuing intellectual questions with an Africana focus. So it seemed like a no-brainer to share that with students, highlighting the partnership that's established here, and the semester-long exchange, while happily spending Brown's money educating students through experiential learning, which Maya is also doing. And I've just returned from my 9th spring break in Mississippi. One day I'll have a spring break of my own, but for now, this is what I'm doing, and I love it. So I wrote a longer explanation of the pedagogy behind the trip in an article in the Black Scholar in 2006, so check it out if you're interested. But I've always found that in my years of teaching, that despite enthusiasm and a real sense of social justice that many of our students have, coming to the beginning of my classes, they were coming to the beginning of my classes with a distorted vision of African American mass movements, actually most movements, it wasn't just Ronald Reagan, right? And the ultra-heroic narratives that they had left very little room for the smaller, quieter types of activism that chipped away at racism and sought to build safe and productive lives. And most held on to the traditional timelines, which Joanne mentioned earlier, sort of Brown v. Board of Education in '54 to King's assassination in '68. But if you're in Mississippi, this all gets turned around when you realize that the schools don't desegregate till 1970. So what do you do with these definitions and these bookmarks when they don't make sense in other places? So to undo this state memorializing and the distractions, and then to rebuild with critical analysis, particularly in one semester, right? You've got to love the open curriculum for that. I took advantage of the landscape and the fresh opportunities to make history matter. For this generation, overly stimulated orally and visually, I engage with the other senses, and clearly Maya's finding the same success with her work too. So this trip is the Freedom School for Ivy Leaguers. And I say that with tongue in cheek, particularly with Charlie Cobb sitting right in front of me, because I'm acknowledging the privilege that comes from this place and what that privilege allows us to do. And of course, it's an alternative freedom school from the one designed by Charlie Cobb in '64 for the Freedom Summer Campaign. This is an emancipation from the classroom and all its restrictions and rigidity. And it's one of personal transformation, because as scholar Charles Payne noted, emancipatory education is also intended to be transformative. It transformed me and many of the students who have participated, some of whom are in this room. And so one of my pedagogical goals is to develop different skills. And so there's observation and also participation. Thanks to the Tougaloo and Brown partnership, our students live in the dormitories with Tougaloo students, and there are opportunities for two-way learning. And the place and the students' experiences become primary sources as well. So here's a very brief description of the spring break itinerary, and I'm going to pepper them with photographs taken over the 9 years. So there's tons of different people here. Some of you might recognize Thor. And I'm happy to answer more questions later if you have more for any specific detail. So this is a semester-long commitment from the beginning of the application process in late January to spring break, and then all the way to the end of the semester and the presentations. Before we leave, so the weeks before spring break, I meet with the selected students at least twice as a group and once individually beforehand. And these group meetings begin the bonding process, reading, discussing 2 books, to arm them with some crucial analytical tools rooted in Africana methodology. Again, students coming from all different backgrounds and concentrations, so I can't assume a baseline knowledge. Often I've used my own book, Crossroads at Clarksdale, because it's about Mississippi, and then Anne Moody's autobiography, Coming of Age in Mississippi, to ensure this baseline knowledge of place and its people, while also having conversations about students' expectations and what they might see. So I wanted them to read about African Americans with African Americans at the center of the analysis and with their voices prominent. So we travel on Saturday, and on Sunday we attend a church service, usually in Mount Helm in Jackson, the oldest African American church in Jackson. This year after church, we went to the new Mississippi Museums in Jackson. They opened in December, and there's a lot to talk about there. One side is the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, a beautiful space that requires multiple visits to really absorb everything. This is the light sculpture that anchors the middle of it. I visited twice, still need to go again. And on the other side is the Mississippi History Museum, full of artifacts and full of contradictions. Our week in Mississippi pivots around a 2-day excursion to the Mississippi Delta, and we do that on Monday and Tuesday. In the last few years, we've done this trip with a group of Tougaloo students and a faculty member from there, trying to facilitate more of a partnership and more of a connection between the students. So far it's been really successful, and I know many students have remained in touch between the campuses. That Monday, we load up the van, drive north to Memphis, Tennessee, which is just over the state line, and we visit the National Civil Rights Museum located at the site of the Lorraine Motel and the boarding house from which Martin Luther King's assassin, James Ray, fired his fatal shot. For those of you who've been there, you know there's a lot to see and absorb, so it takes the whole afternoon. We decompress by driving down to the mighty Mississippi River, where you can see Arkansas on the other side. And then we head south back into Mississippi on Highway 61, straight into the Delta. The night's inexpensive stay at a casino in Tunica anchors the 2-day trip, and I want students to see the stark contrast of the Delta's poverty against the opulence of the casino strip, and think about the local and regional implications of having that space exist. The next morning, we drive 1 hour to Clarksdale, where we go to the Delta Blues Museum, located in the now defunct Illinois Central Railroad Terminal. It's one of the sites of desegregation, but you'd never know by going there now. It's a homage to the blues, but not to the rich Black activist history in the region, a history I've written about, and there's a lot to say about that, right? And the reframing of a region to capitalize on heritage tourism. On our way out of Clarksdale, we pass through the infamous, this is Ground Zero, which is run by Morgan Freeman, and one of our students wrote on the symbol there. This is in 2015. When I went back this year, they changed it all out. But the whole place is covered with graffiti from visitors. On our way out of Clarksdale, we passed through the infamous 61 and 49 crossroads, where blues guitarist Robert Johnson supposedly sold his soul to the devil for superior musical skills. And we paused at the Hopson Plantation 2 miles away, the place where the mechanical cotton gin was developed. And there's a lot more to say here about how the plantation has also curated their history, so if you're interested, you can ask me, particularly about the Shack Up Inn. We continue down Highway 49. We visit Glendora, Mississippi, and the Emmett Till Historic Intrepid Center. This is a locally community-run museum housed in the former cotton gin, where Till's murderers, Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam, seized the gin that pinned the boy they mutilated into the water's depths. This museum, in stark contrast to the Mississippi Museums, the National Civil Rights Shrine to King, and the Delta Blues Museum, most vividly highlights how local politics affect public commemoration and the location of memorials. Which narratives get public money? Who has to raise private money in order to be heard? And in this way, students are confronted with the politics of memory making. I direct our wonderful driver down the unpaved roads in the back to the site where a fisherman found Till's body. The community worked really hard to put a marker there, but every time I've gone, the marker is illegible because of the number of bullet holes defacing the surface, or simply it's not there. So this year it's not there at all. It's been sawn off at the base, but I've been there enough times I knew the spot. It's a really hard place to visit, and I've gone at least 10 times, and it doesn't get any easier. We next go to the Bryant store in Money, the site of Till's supposed interaction with Carolyn Bryant. We say supposed because she actually admitted she lied. It's now a facade. I've seen 10 years of deterioration. Groups have tried to buy the property to preserve it, but the owners seem intent on letting it, and I'm sure hoping that the history will also rot with it. From there, we drive through Greenwood, where I watch students tackle the reality of literally crossing the tracks. The visually violent residential segregation that separates manicured lawns and SUVs from shacks and dire poverty. And our ride back to Jackson is usually pretty quiet. An archival experience at the State Archives takes up the next 2 days and adds another layer. I guided them through the necessary preparation process that had occurred before they reached Mississippi, and I'd met with students individually to discuss their project choices, pointing them towards resources, brainstorming, and the like. So I know the archive is there well because I continue to research there myself, and every year we bring students, so they expect us, and we are well received. Students there, many students have never had archival experience. They've never touched paper touched by Medgar Evers or Martin Luther King, and some of the many other people they've read about. And so it's another layer of introducing a very low stakes research project and archival work. A couple of years, every once in a while, our trip coincides with the Mississippi Veterans of the Civil Rights Movement Conference, where students get to meet civil rights veterans, many of my personal heroes. When the timing isn't right, students get more time on campus before we leave on Sunday. So these are pictures of two veterans who spend a lot of time with our students. So I talked about how the trip stimulates the senses, touch, sight, smells, and sound, but we also genuflect towards another sense, the taste. We eat very well in Mississippi, and I warn everyone to kind of fast before we go. So the running joke is that you know, if you are vegan, you enter Mississippi vegan and you leave it at the airport. And sure enough, we had many moments where people couldn't help themselves. This restaurant no longer exists for obvious reasons. Fried pickles. So when we've returned, it's a heads down rush to the end of the semester. As you know, April is crazy here. We meet to debrief, regroup, process. Dean Bhattacharya, who by the way is the person who makes it all happen at the Dean of the College, we try and get feedback on mishaps and where we can improve and better plan, and we always have meetings with our Tougaloo counterparts. At the end of the semester, presentations constitute the top and final layer of their learning. Opportunities to formally present their work are not readily available to most students, and as this trip doesn't constitute a course, right, they're doing this on top of their curriculum. The oral presentation is the student's only responsibility or mode of accountability and a way to evaluate their learning. In this formal setting, students hone their presentation skills, learning to summarize their research or the process of doing research, and sort of how to effectively communicate, and it adds another experiential and transferable skill to the many that they had acquired over the semester. So while this trip increases students' overall learning, they get to see how history lives. I also learn so much from them. I see how I can teach more effectively, and every year I'm learning something. What animates students? I learn about them in ways not possible in formal classrooms. Some of the reactions every year to certain things are exactly the same, and it's just fascinating to watch. It makes me a better teacher and a better scholar too. I understand my own research, and the stakes of that research become a lot clearer when you're trying to explain it, or sometimes you don't have to explain it because they can see it. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity to do this work and to pay it forward in really interesting and useful ways. There's a lot more to say. I don't want to take up any more time, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Jean, Francoise, and Maya, for a really interesting start. This is a round table, so we're going to move very quickly to questions from the floor and responses from up here. I just wanted to say a couple of things quickly before to kick it off, as it were. There actually was a question that accompanied this panel, and it is, how do we teach about the civil rights movement and make the movement relevant to students today? And I should have said that before, but so you get the context in which some of these questions were answered. They're basically two responses I want to refer to. Obviously, both Maya and Francois spoke directly to the question, how do we teach the civil rights movement, and particularly to young people? And I was particularly moved by that young gentleman who basically said that he had learned more in his trip through the South than his entire career. That tells us that obviously one of the critical questions here is getting people to the place, the sights, smells, and sounds, as you said, Francois. And this is very important. Of course, the other two questions that strike me are, first of all, the obvious one as to what do you teach? What kind of history? And this refers more to some of the things that Jean said in relation to, is it the history of the great person, or the great moment, the gesture, or is it a different kind of history which we have to constantly return to, not once and for all, but perhaps each generation, to rethink what it is that is important to them. And this certainly came out with the Rosa Parks question. But more particularly, how do you address a particular phenomenon that is always associated with the building of great heroes or great heroines, and that is the incorporation of them into the mainstream and the de-radicalization of what they did or meant. So these seem to be the questions that are on the floor. And I mean, obviously, the direction of how we teach has to do with engaging young people at a level which motivates them and animates them. The question of what we teach is a more complex one, and perhaps we can throw it back to any of us up here to begin to think through, how do we address these obvious questions which are not peculiar to the civil rights movement, but peculiar to the way in which figures in history are incorporated, both to neutralize them, but also to commodify them. And how do we address that? So it's open on the floor.
So when I got to the Rosa Parks research, right, it was by way of, like, I began my career looking at the civil rights movement outside the South, right, and studying the movement in Boston and LA and trying to put back into the narrative not just those cities, but really a kind of changing of how we imagine where the civil rights movement took place. And part of that project was to think about all the people, all the movements, that we didn't know. And I think one of the things that's been interesting when I did the Parks book was how useful going back to the things we think we know is for teaching, actually. And partly conveniently, Rosa Parks tends to be at the beginning of a civil rights movement class. Just chronologically, you do it right in 55. But it's to kind of go back to Rosa Parks and kind of give this much bigger history, right, that begins with Scottsboro, right, that ends basically when she dies, that crosses civil rights and Black power and North and South and all these different issues and inside the United States and outside the United States. But it's, for me, and I've heard this from other people doing this, kind of new work with, teaching her as well now, that it allows for a different kind of critical analysis to be centered, right? So it's like, whoa, if this story that I thought I knew, if this person that I thought I knew actually falls apart, then then it just raises so many questions about, well, what you think you know and how history is taught. And so I've increasingly seen not just the historical value, but the pedagogical value in, and when I teach Rosa Parks, like we began with like, what did you learn? How does this reading change what you learned? But what did that old version accomplish? What are the uses of it? Is to sort of think critically about kind of why we get the histories we get. And obviously this is a bigger theme in my new book, right? The kind of idea of the histories we get versus the histories we need. And what do those histories, what are the political uses of these kinds of fables and memorialization? So I think there's something very useful also about working with students on things they think they know as well.
Well, one of the sort of hidden motives in this discussion is that we see individuals, and individuals obviously play critical roles, particularly at critical moments. But in seeing the individuals, we're also hiding the dozens of people who, without them, these individuals would not have been able to accomplish anything. And therefore, there's always a tension between the Rosa Parks and the entire movement,
right,
and the people on the ground. And the question is, how can we constantly, in recognizing the Rosa Parks or the MLKs or whatever, come back to and find ways to introduce these people who make it happen? Well, the floor is open at all times, no. So if anybody wishes to intervene or contradict, you are free to so do. Charlie.
There is a question. The question I had with respect to how you see teaching the movement. Is it on?
You press the bottom and hold it.
Oh, okay. Okay, no?
One more time.
Hello? And I'm an old radio guy.
Yes.
Okay. I have a very specific question with respect to how you see teaching the movement, and that is, what exactly do you mean by civil rights movement? You hear these terms, you know, like civil rights era. What is that? Do you mean the post-World War II period, or do you mean the founding of the Jamestown colony all the way through the 21st century? How do you see, when you say teach the movement, what is this movement in terms of time and their practicalities you have to have some kind of limits?
Me personally, I don't teach with a chronological timeline. For me, I guess maybe so. Civil rights movement history as the center and teaching go back and forth. So whatever subject matter we're talking about in this particular time frame, 1950s, 1960s, giving them the understanding of slavery and where these conditions and social norms are coming from, but then also moving them to the present. I mean, in talking about integration and segregation, you ask students, oh, so do you feel like we're integrated? And of course, they're like, yeah, we're integrated. Like, I can go wherever I want. And then we see what happened last month when, like, black men get kicked out of Starbucks for not buying stuff too quickly. Or even the students at Hope High School where they're like, yeah, my school's integrated. And I'm like, but your school's 90% Latino. And the school across the street from you is predominantly white. And it's a private school, and you think that you're integrated? Okay. And so it's conversations like that I think it makes it easier to teach civil rights per se, in a way to not lock it into this like decade of things that happen and then had like this final ending and then everything's great. That's me personally.
One of the things I do spend a lot of time on in my classes is defining terms. Exactly, is defining terms, right? What is this? What do you think the civil rights movement is, and how would you periodize it? And then, I spend the rest of the semester shattering that, which is a whole lot of fun. But just the example I gave, right? If you look at, if you go from Brown to King, then it leaves out half of Mississippi's civil rights, direct action, mass movement history. But at what point, where on the timeline of the Black freedom struggle does the actual mass movement of the 20th century fit, and where does it work? And is it important to actually pinpoint it and put it on a pedestal, whatever pedestal that might look like?
I think some of you know, I think Charlie knows, right? I mean, I had the great good fortune of learning from, when I took a civil rights movement class, it was with Julian Bond, and then I got to TA for him. And so that has indelibly sort of shaped how I teach it, and I teach it as a chronology. A post-World War II, sort of we start a little bit before World War II, but it's really a kind of post-World War II. But it's also about kind of expanding in all sorts of ways. So I teach at the City University of New York, and so we very much focus a lot on the civil rights movement in New York City. Certainly, lately, one of the things that I have started to do is, I used to be very resistant to the term civil rights movement. I would always be like, Black freedom struggle, Black freedom struggle. And then I was like, man, we're ceding the ground. So then my students come in thinking there's a civil rights movement over here that really is the way that they were taught, like that it was like passive and respectable and nice and everybody liked them. And it's like, no. So I've sort of started to use the civil rights movement, like that phrasing more, even to encompass things that, from, again, Scottsboro to Black Power, reparations, Gary, all of these things. Yeah. So, but I mean, when I was talking about sort of teaching the civil rights movement, I was talking about teaching kind of the modern post World War II Black freedom struggle.
Thank you. Firstly, on behalf of CSSJ, I would like to publicly congratulate Charlie Cobb, who is now an Andrew Carnegie Fellow. Congrats, Charlie. But secondly, Charlie, in this department, a couple years ago, came here as a visiting professor to teach, quote unquote, the civil rights movement. And I would just like to throw the question back at you. As somebody who was deeply active in the movement, what was it like to teach, quote unquote, the movement while you were here? And what kind of things do you think we now should be thinking about as somebody who was both participant and also talk about?
I plan to talk about that tomorrow. I really want to, let me be very, very quick here. I think that most often the movement is taught wrongly. And the point about the movement that's missed is the organizing tradition at the grassroots. What we get instead, and Julian, as you know, talked about this a lot, we get the idea that the movement is defined by mass protests in public spaces led by charismatic leaders. So my first concern in terms of substance is getting that idea across, and I have to figure out the ways and means of doing that. And then secondly, I quickly discovered in classes here that I had to work on not simply come to a decision about the information I wanted to convey, but the ways and means of doing that. I had to work on a language that worked for young people for whom the decade of the 60s, when I was involved, is distant. you know, I remember talking to some kids, not college, these were middle school kids, and when I told them I knew Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer, one of them jumped to his feet and said, "Mr. Cobb, you was alive back then?" So, given the distance,
What's the answer?
you know, and it's funny, I mean, they're very specific things in terms of working out the language, like explaining a mimeograph machine, you know, or a party line. You know, explaining that you didn't fly to places, you took the bus. There's a whole question of language that I found in teaching that you had to figure out what worked best, what connect. We had lots of discussions in classes about nonviolence, which was a really alien idea. The whole notion of that is hard to get across, even as a tactic, let alone as a philosophy or way of life. That's all a part of the language teaching that I had to, it was a struggle for me to figure out how to do that in an effective and meaningful way. And like I said, I'll talk more about this tomorrow, I think. Somebody.
One of the things, it seems to me, that as we look at the struggle, it's sort of a relay race. And, you know, I think that part of the teaching is not only to talk about what happened in the past before, but what happens when you get handed the baton. So how do you begin to deal with that? I mean, I think for young people, I mean, one of the things I've come to learn in my years is that even if you do all that is necessary, it won't be sufficient. And that's a humbling thought. So how do you begin to talk about the relay race, and how is it possible to give them a sense that they have to do what is necessary, but that what they will do also will not be sufficient? Is it possible? I'm not sure.
I think one of the, is helping students to understand why history matters, that it was a movement of young people, and that what we're seeing now is a movement of young people, but it's not, and trying to get them to understand that what they're seeing now isn't new, right? It's not a new phenomenon that young people become the leaders and try and really shape the direction of the nation or a discourse. We were seeing part of the students, particularly Black Lives Matter, before them and continuing. So understanding why history matters, that they have it. There's a legacy to stand on. And if the people before, the generations before didn't do it, then they wouldn't be where they are. It's their responsibility to keep the torch going. So helping them understand where they are on that timeline, and understanding that this is a movement of young people, their age, right? Many of you left college to do exactly what you did, and they're in their space now. So that's one way in which it's also terrifying for them, right? To think, what are you willing to die for? Because people your age were willing to die for something and gave up their education or access to their education to do it. And it becomes, it's hard, but that's one way in which I try and do it.
I very much like the idea of a relay race. I think that gives a sense of continuity, but in a relay race, sometimes you want to look at a particular runner on the backstretch who is really fast, and that's like a conjunctural moment. So you replay that part when he gets the baton and runs with it. So like the civil rights movement is, the 60s is like a conjunctural moment. It's like a really fast backstretch run, which makes all the difference to the next leg. But except this race is not just a 4x1. It keeps on going around. But I like that idea because it does convey continuity, but it allows us to focus on legs.
I mean, I think part of what I try to do, both in class and in my new book, is these mythologies about the civil rights movement, right? Then students take into themselves as they think about sort of what they're trying to organize today, right? And so I think trying to kind of take those apart, right? So this idea that the civil rights movement wasn't disruptive, right? Like partly why I started with that ridiculous Kasim Reed quote is just like, right, like Dr. King would never take a high, what do you think Selma Montgomery March was? But also just this notion that somehow the civil rights movement was just like not disruptive and peaceful, and everybody liked it, right? And so kind of making sure that students understand that most people did not like it, and most people did not like it not just in Mississippi, but in New York, right? So the polls in New York are saying a majority of New Yorkers, aren't in favor. And I think part of why I do that is, and showing them the variety of ways that people perpetuated racism. So it's not just, what I think is sort of the dangerous way we tend to sort of envision racism in the Southern redneck, and we miss all the other kinds of racism that were key to kind of maintaining the sort of structures. And to me, part of why I do that is precisely to give my students tools to see what they're in, right? Because I think the mythologies of the civil rights movement, because it's such a singular, like it's such a big moment, right, then become barriers, right? So how do you imagine to do it again, right? If Rosa Parks sits down and everybody just is ready to boycott, right, then it's just like, well, when I protested injustice, people didn't do that, right? 50,000 people didn't stop doing the thing that, right? And so you have to see all these things and all this organizing that goes into getting to those moments. Or you have to see that, like, people's families don't like what they're doing. People's colleges don't like what they're doing, right? And that I think those give students different tools to then imagine how they go forward and take the struggle to, to kind of take the next leg of it.
I think for me, working with high school students, a lot of the work that I do is just talking to them. A lot of the workshops are discussion-based. When we're on the trip, we talk a lot at the end of the night. There are times where it's quiet, there's heated debate. But I think one thing that, Cortland, you mentioned was you doing the work and it being insufficient. And so I think that is very discouraging for students to realize that they're gonna do all this and then nothing may happen. And some of them struggle with, well, they meet a bunch of activists, some who are well-known, less known, and they say, well, this person did all that and we're still here. So then what do I do? What more can I give? But I think it's the activists that reinvigorate them and give them that energy, and they feel a sense of responsibility. Because this person did this for me, I must now do it for the next generation. But then we also struggle with issues like martyrdom. So throughout the trip, you can see, again, well-known faces, but also people they've never heard of before, and then they're actually more upset by the people that they've never heard of before. And then also things like jail, no bail. So we're in Birmingham, and we meet Barbara Mines, who was 15 years old when she joined the Children's March. And she tells the story about how she spent a week being moved from prison to prison, and they're singing freedom songs, and they're just feeding them bread and moldy milk. But jail, no bail was necessary for the movement at that time. But when we're living in an era of mass incarceration, what does that look like for young people? None of them want to go to jail. But then also, again, Bloody Sunday. Some of the students meet John Lewis and thinking about how it's not a peaceful, pretty thing like we tell them all the time. You see Bloody Sunday and you walk across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and a lot of students break down on the other side. And so with all that said, and thinking about Bloody Sunday, martyrdom, jail, no bail, I try to get students to imagine a freedom without death. And maybe that will make the insufficiency enough for them to actually do the work.
I would like to go back to your point of integration and separating Latino from Black in modern history. I'm not sure if you're aware that most of the Latino country had slavery and have a lot of African Americans. So I think in a way of us working into integration, I think validating the feeling that the student feel that there is integration amongst minority is a great point to take things to the next level. And Afro-Latina, and I can be Black and I can be Latina. And I have a history of slavery in the Dominican Republic. It was actually one of the biggest slavery in history. And most of those islands in the Caribbean, if not all, also have slavery history and racism and discrimination and all that comes with it. So I think elevating and educating the student as to do some research and investigation of why they feel is integrated rather than negating that is no integrated because they're Latino is a better way to us get where we want to go.
For me, in making that comment, it's not necessarily to separate Blacks from Latinos. I don't force Black identity on anyone because there are a lot of Latinos who don't see themselves as Black. And that's something that needs to be addressed as well in the classroom. But what I'm saying in particular, there was a student in the cohort last year who is a Latina from Dominican Republic. And we were sitting in a workshop and she asked me, well, can I wear a Black Lives Matter t-shirt? And I was like, why not? And she was like, well, I'm not Black. And I was like, oh, okay, but you're from Dominican Republic, right? And like, I was like, you know, some of the first enslaved people were in Hispaniola, Dominican Republic. And it just didn't click with her. And it wasn't until we were in Memphis, Tennessee. We were at this National Civil Rights Museum, and a lot of archives from Brown are actually in that museum. But there was one in particular where she saw Caribbean plantations, Dominican Republic. And it wasn't until that moment that she was like, well, if I'm Dominican and there was enslaved people in the Caribbean and Dominican Republic, then that means I'm Black. And that was the first time that she saw herself as Black. And that was not something that I could put on her. That was something she had to figure out for herself. So yeah.
One of the initiatives we took here at Africana at Brown year before last, was to start a course called Global Black Radicalism, which looks not so much at the 60s, but more the 60s going into the 70s, looking at the Caribbean, at North America, at Brazil, and Africa, and the African Liberation Movement. So in doing that, immediately the lens shifts and you begin to focus on concrete experiences, their intersection, their differences, but their underlying commonalities in that moment, in that leg of the relay of the 1970s. So I think it's very much something that we need to think about, particularly in the contemporary context, where there are these communities who sometimes see themselves positioned differently. But this also applies to communities that here in the United States who consider themselves Black, but don't consider themselves African American. So that's another problem which we need to address as well.
What question I had, one, just the idea of the commodification, right, and the appropriation of this horrific, history for some people's gain is very disturbing. That's the question I really want to ask is, and it has to do with like taking the individual, making them a hero, and somehow that they move the people instead of the people move the movement. Do people have a story about who you're teaching and who you're having conversations with in the courses that you're going, of moving from the idea of the individual and the individual heroism, which is very much a part of our dominant ethos. It's like it's your individual initiative, and it's not about people behind you. So it's going from the individual to understanding the collectivists, that it's a collective movement, which I think you're talking about the grassroots, but talking about collectivism, and that's hard for us to understand when we're steeped in a culture that's all about the individual. do you see that in the work when you're teaching, that change in the understanding of the students that you're teaching or working with?
I don't know if I see a change in what they do, but it's not because I didn't tell them. Yeah, I mean, I'm always pretty clear of telling them that I don't think Dr. King wanted to have a statue. You know, that's not what he was about. Definitely Mrs. Parks wasn't interested in that. From what I know of SNCC and CORE, the idea of a beloved community is that, right? It's about the community and not about any one individual. So this whole idea of we, and that bond that keeps you together and keeps you alive, right? The support network is crucial. And it doesn't single one person out at any point, because it also puts a bigger target on them anyway. So it's always there when I teach and lecture, and I try and make those claims, you know, so suggest how would that look now, and yet, you know, when I think about student politics, I don't always see it being translated, but I try to stay out of student politics too. That's it.
So, and I don't know if other people have experienced this, but one of the things that I find with my students and teaching is actually the need to talk about the power of the individual, which is not the same as talking about the kind of icons, but that, because I think in some sense the ways that the civil rights movement, like, again, has this kind of place in the popular imagination, makes it so kind of unreachable to us that we have to be so exceptional and so, and so one of the things that I often talk about and teach about is this idea of how so many of these things start with small groups of people, right? And so the kind of idea of Greensboro beginning with like 4 friends, right? And like sort of getting basically literally asking the question, do you have 3 friends? Right? And they always laugh, right? But it's sort of about the like, most of us have 3 friends. And so to imagine that being kind of an agent for change, because I guess I find my students not necessarily kind of in a visceral way believing in the power of the individual, which is different than, again, like, which is a different point than you're making. I'm just saying this is one of the things I've been thinking about a lot is that part of how I end up teaching the Black freedom struggle is about all of these moments where sort of all different kinds of people sort of take steps beyond kind of the, you know, what's possible to, and then what happened, you know, and then how they're able to do that in all different kinds, and right, tons of young people in all different situations are taking these steps, but often taking these steps in small groups of people before it becomes a bigger thing. And so, I don't know, I've been thinking about that a lot lately.
I think we spend a lot of time talking about community on this trip. And when you go to the South, you see community in a way that you don't see particularly in the North. But then we ask students, if you go home, like, can you go ask your neighbor for a cup of sugar? And half our students are like, I don't even know my neighbor's name. And so when we meet activists and go to different museums and churches and you see how significant community was, I think it gives young people a lot to think about today in terms of collective versus the individual, and the need for community today, which is not something we really see.
I think that's all the time we have. So the struggle continues. The discussion as to how to teach the civil rights movement and make it relevant to students today. And we have some ways to do this that we've discussed here, and the conversation continues as well. Thank you very much.